Hey everybody, purpose of today's video is just to take you step by step through my reloading process when I reload a rifle cartridge. I try to do the same thing every time. I try to be consistent, and these are the steps that I take. I understand other people's processes might be a little different, but I just kind of wanted to take you through, show you mine, and maybe this will help somebody out. My first step is going to be to take my dirty brass and run it through a dry media tumbler. Now this is a Frankfurt Arsenal tumbler, and what I use for media is this is walnut shell. You can find this in like a pet store for reptile bedding, and you can get a pretty good sized bag for pretty cheap. And this stuff does a lot better job than the corncob media. So what I do is I start my tumbler up and I pour in a little bit of this new finish as it's running, kind of let that mix in before I pour my brass in. And then I usually tumble my rifle brass for about 3 hours. So after the tumbler finishes, I go ahead and pour everything into this media separator. And this is also from Frankfurt Arsenal. And go ahead and give this a couple of quick spins. Separate the media out from the cases. Okay, so now that the brass is clean and I've sorted by caliber, this next step is not going to be something you need to do every single time, but since I am setting up a new die set, this is a very important step. Now, it's not necessarily as important with a modern cartridge like the one I'm going to be doing here, which is a 6-arc. But it's very important with any legacy cartridges, or especially something like a belted Magnum, because one of the main benefits of reloading one of those cartridges is going to be being able to control your headspace off the shoulder instead of on the belt, and then just controlling your headspace in general on one of the more legacy cartridges. So if you follow the steps to set up your resizing die, of course we're talking full-length resizing die, but if you follow the steps that are listed with the die, it's going to tell you something like basically you bring the press ram to the top, you screw your die in until it makes contact, you give it another 1/8 turn or something like that, so that when you size to the top with that ram, it's pushing that cartridge all the way into the die and resizing it basically the most that the die will let you size it. Now, like I said, if you've got a modern well-designed cartridge like a 6-arc, likely when you set it up that way, it's going to be just fine. But it's always helpful to check. So basically what we're checking is I've taken and I've made some reference measurements here on new ammunition and some new brass. But basically all you're doing is I'm using a set of these Hornady cartridge headspace gauge kits, and they have different size reference guides here. So basically you set it up on your caliper like this, and the measurement is not really that important because you're just using it as a reference between different scenarios. So I've taken some measurements of brand new brass, brand new factory ammunition, and they all come out about the same. So what I'm going to do now is I've got fired brass, so I'm going to just measure that, several pieces, and I'm going to make a note of the difference between the new brass and the fired brass. Now the purpose of this is that when we set up our reloading die, we want to set the shoulder, we want to size the cartridge where it sets the shoulder back about 1 to 2 thousandths less than what our fired dimension is. So these have been fired in my rifle. They're fire formed to the chamber. So now we want to bump that shoulder no more than about 2 thousandths back so we're not overworking the brass. So this set of gauges is going to allow us to know exactly how big our chamber is with a piece of fired brass, and then bump it back 1 to 2 thousandths of an inch. All right, next step is going to be to go ahead and get the cases lubed and then start sizing. So I like to use this Hornady One Shot. It's the simplest, easiest, and cleanest method to do it, in my opinion. And the one caveat of this is that you do need to use quite a bit in order to keep the cases from getting stuck. And this is a method that I'm going to show you is something I've adopted fairly recently based on another suggestion that I found out there, and it works pretty good. So I'm just going to take a gallon Ziploc baggie. I'm going to put, you know, just as many cases as I can get fully coated in there. I might do them in a couple batches, but I'm going to put cases in here, just spray down in the bag, shake them a little bit, spray some more, shake them up a little bit more, and then get to sizing. Once I've got them all lubed, put them in a little container here. Give me easy access as I'm sizing. So since this is my first time running this die, I went ahead and just followed the instructions that come in the box. But I'm going to run a case through. I'm going to check my length, and I'm going to just run several cases through until I get that length adjusted to bumping the shoulder back about 2 thousandths. That one was pretty close. I'm going to see if we're going to be consistent on this one. You know, that one's a little bit long. I'm probably going to have to bump this die in just a touch. Of course, you don't want excessive, you don't want to run excessive headspace, but you also don't want to make them too long, especially in a gas gun like these are going to be in, because they just won't chamber. If you've got them a little bit long in a bolt gun, a lot of times you can kind of do a crush fit because you've got a bolt handle to crank on, but in a gas gun they just won't chamber. Yeah, I'm consistently a couple thousandths too long, so I'm going to go ahead and bump it in, and just the tiniest amount. See what that does for us. I have 2 single stage presses. I only use my Hornady on my gas gun stuff. I don't love the locking collar that the press has. I prefer that it would just screw the die straight in. I've got an older RCBS press and I like it better. I use it for all my bolt gun stuff that requires quite a bit more force. But I don't love the design of the Hornady one. going to bump it in just a tiny bit more. This part can be a little bit tedious, but once you get them set up, you shouldn't have to do this again. I think I like that pretty well. Now, as far as cleaning lube off of cases after you fired them, what I do is just I lay them out on a rag, and I just kind of come over and I just by hand I just kind of rub the lube off after I'm done sizing, and that's all I do. I know some people will throw their brass back in the tumbler. That's an option. The only issue with that is you will need to check all of your cases to make sure that you don't get little bits of media in the flash hole if you do it that way. That is an option, and that gets them cleaner. I always just kind of wipe them off, and they are a little bit tackier than they would be otherwise, but it doesn't bother me. So now that I'm set up, we'll go ahead and knock out all this sizing, and then I'll move on to the next step. So after I've got the brass sized appropriately, next step is to do all the trimming, chamfering, and deburring. So you don't have to necessarily trim rifle brass every time. It just depends on how fussy you want to be. As long as it's not over the trim length, you can run it multiple times. Since I went ahead and bought this Frankfurt Arsenal trimming center, I've changed up my process to where I just trim every time because this thing makes it so easy, and I can't recommend these enough. These are awesome. So basically they come with these different collets to set for different case sizes, but there's instructions on how you get the trimmer set up, but once you've got it set up, it's really simple. You just stick the case in there for a few seconds, trim it, and then you go straight to chamfer, deburr, and then you can put another tool here. I put a primer pocket cleaner tool in there just because. But I'm going to do this with some 223 brass just to show you that there is one additional step if you're using brass that has a crimped primer pocket. So there's lots of different tools out there for removing crimps on primer pockets. I found the simplest way is to use one of these old school chamfer tools, and unlike most of the newer style are these VLDs, these longer, thinner chamfer tools, get one of these old school ones that are kind of fat, and that's perfect to get in there and cut that crimp out of a primer pocket. And you don't have to go crazy on these, just a couple turns, just to cut that metal around the edge there so you can get a primer in, and that's really all it takes. So I usually do that first, go through, sort whatever needs to be done. Anything that needs primer pockets, crimps removed, I'll go ahead and do all that. And then once I've got a big batch, I'll go ahead and run them all through the machine. So I'll run a couple through here just to kind of show you how it works. To prime cases, I use one of these Hornady handheld priming tools. A lot of different tools out there. There's, pretty much anybody who makes reloading parts has a hand priming tool. This is what I always use. It's what I recommend. The only time I don't use it is when I'm loading pistol on my progressive press, but most presses have a provision to prime with the press. and that's a really slow, tedious way to do it. This is pretty fast. It's easy to kind of get a feel for it and control your seating pressure. By far my favorite way to do it, and it's pretty fast. Now, when it comes to measuring powder, if you're using traditional extruded powders, you can't beat a tool like this. Now, I reloaded for many years with just a digital scale, and one thing I never actually used was a trickler. I would actually just use a little plastic spoon and dip my powder, dump it onto my scale, and just kind of tap the last few kernels to get to those. To get to the right weight and load it that way. But an auto dispensing scale like this is just, I mean, it's a game changer when you go to that. Now, if you're reloading ball powders, that's a different story. You can use traditional powder measure. You can see I have a number of volumetric powder measures here. This is probably the one, this Hornady one's the one I've had the longest, the one I use the most. This Lee dispenser, it's actually a decent solution to measure something like Varget, something that's got pretty small grains. But for the most part, these are only good for ball powders. So nothing wrong with using one of these if you're using a ball powder. I still use ball powders when I reload like bulk 223, but for all the extruded stuff, I even now that I have the auto dispensing powder measure, I rarely even use this one, even for Varget. Another great benefit of a scale like this is if you're doing load development or just kind of a load workup, all you have to do is just type in your different powder charges and dispense as many of each charge as you want, and just kind of change them on the fly. So it really is something that I wouldn't ever want to go back from having. Now, if you get an overage, I just dump it back in and let it restart. The overage rates on this particular one are really not too bad. I know there are some people on this particular one who use what they call the straw trick, which is basically you cut a short section of like a sonic straw and place it in there and give yourself a little extra room of smooth, basically like a smooth bore, and they say that helps drop a little more consistently. I don't really have a problem with the consistency, so I've never done that. It seems to work just fine for me. Another important tool is a good funnel. Now this is just a Lyman, but there's lots of good ones out there. There's really high dollar ones, there's really cheap ones. It's really kind of up to you, but as long as you have a funnel that is, the only issue I've really had is having, when you reload 22 or something like that, having a funnel that's small enough to not trap kernels around the neck. So this one works pretty well. I've got a number of others for different calibers, but lots of different options out there. When it comes to seating bullets, this is maybe the most straightforward part of the process. Typically, I'm going to rely on a manual, especially in a magazine-fed gun. I'm just going to load whatever the recommendation of the load manual is, or to the maximum length that's allowed in the magazine. Now, on a gun where you have a bullet that's not typical, or you're trying to load to meet the lands, there's a lot of different ways to figure out how far out to load your bullet. I know Hornady has some tools where you have like a little case that you put in the chamber. It's like a little case with a that's threaded in the back for their little tool. You put it in there, and then you can put a cleaning rod in the other end and kind of play with it back and forth and figure out your overall length. I actually typically make my own little tool. So this is just a sized case, and I take a Dremel and I cut a little slit in the neck here. That allows me to just place a bullet in there, run it into the, run the bolt on the gun a couple times, measure it. You know, once I get some consistency where it's coming out the exact same every time, that kind of gives me a starting point, because I know basically where the rifling is starting to push that bullet back into the case. So that actually works really well for me. It's a really cheap option, but there's only a couple guns that I actually have to do something like that for. And, you know, one-time deal. Once you get it kind of figured out for that bullet, you don't really have to do it again. Now, one thing I don't do is I don't measure cartridge base to ogive. I just measure the overall length. I've always done it this way, and for the most part, I'm loading these like tipped bullets, so they're very consistent on the length of the bullet itself. And you know, if you're loading like a hollow point boat tail bullet, those hollow points typically have some length variation just because the tips aren't exactly perfect. But as far as seating goes, your seating die is what's controlling the consistency of your depth. So knowing that the hollow point bullets are a little bit different on the tips, I'm usually looking for a range. So I understand that some of the bullets are going to measure a little longer, some of them are going to measure a little less once they're seated, but usually I'm just shooting for something in the middle of that number that I want to get to. And once I start seating, I know that if I get one that's a couple thousandths less or a couple thousandths more, that's not my seating die having inconsistency. That's just an inconsistency in the height of that tip. So, like I said, with the tip bullet, you can measure overall length with your caliper just fine. Tips are consistent. I'd say the only other note about what I do as far as bullet seating is that I don't crimp. I don't crimp anything. I don't crimp for gas guns, and I don't crimp for bolt guns. So I know you can buy separate crimping dies and all kinds of stuff like that, or most seating dies will crimp if you just run them down and add a little crimp with the die, but I don't do that. I just back the die out so it doesn't crimp at all. Other than just making sure you match your seating stem to the style of bullet you're using. If you use like an old school seating stem on one of these long, really thin jacketed bullets, sometimes you'll get a crease where that stem is basically bending the metal in. But that's just something where you have to match your die to the style of bullet that you're using. That's pretty much my whole process from start to finish. For rifle cartridges, I do the same thing every time. I try to keep it consistent. Doesn't really matter what I'm loading. I'm following the same procedure. So anyway, hope this is helpful to somebody out there, maybe just getting started, or anybody who might be looking to make tweaks in their process. But thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.